But now we are moving out of the Middle Ages. We are moving out of the analysis that comes with literature, because our next speaker is Professor Luigi TROIANI, who belongs in the social sciences. He is a professor of international relations at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. He works and writes for La Voce di New York and America Oggi on this side of the Atlantic. And he has recently co-edited for Forum Italicum the special issue La letteratura italiana di ispirazione socialista. His talk today is entitled How the Epidemics and Pandemics Affect the State's Affairs and in International Relations, the Case of COVID-19. Professor TROIANI, you have the floor.
Thanks, Giuseppe, for giving me the floor, and thanks for organizing this event, which apparently is very actual, and sorry for the attendance that we skip from Boccaccio to our miserable things of states affair and international relations affair, but that's it. Here is where we live. My contribution to the present debate aims at tracing in the history of the pandemics some frequencies which structurally influenced the international politics. This exercise will permit the elaboration of a theory and a model on the effects of pandemics on international affairs, which I will offer to your consideration. If we assume that the states and the international community are in force to satisfy the prevailing values and the material needs of the populations they govern, we should consequently admit that their most stringent task is to guarantee the survival of the states and their populations. Primum vivere. Basic factors such as strength and wealth contribute in keeping the states alive and functioning. The state needs power to affirm itself in a hostile environment, and the international system needs power to discourage any subject from violating the existing international order. The internal and international political systems may resist a short-term economic crisis and a short-term attack, but they risk to be disrupted if those attacks last for too long. Armaments and wealth are not enough to guarantee the state's survival. So the first hypothesis is that the state have, first of all, to take care of their survival. And I say armaments and wealth are not enough. The states and the international community need also consensus and effective ruling, shared values, and an appropriate level of public health and welfare. The last mentioned factors concerns the very survival of the states, and it is what I will mostly refer to in my speech. The political ideologies and ethics of the contemporary states consider the health of the populations as strategic as never before in the history. Rarely during the millennia of humankind history before the 19th century, the states assisted the poor and the ignorant, the wounded or the infected or the sick. Samaritans, religious and moral subjects were taking care of those things, more than the states, often. The states were busy with the wars and the glory of the prince. We should not forget that our ancestors were very religious and or superstitious. The will of God and the personal destiny and fortune mattered more than they presently do. And this culture was not making high the demand to the states for intervening for public health. Let's say this is the effect. The Enlightenment, instead, taught people that they had to search rational solutions to the health challenges they had to cope with, that science was the answer, that no link existed between committing sins and getting sick, and that repenting didn't help that much. In the late 19th century, the European states started approving legislations which marked the dawning of the healthcare systems, with the related expenditures becoming part of states' budgets. The reaction to the Big Depression of the 30s increased healthcare budgets. The same happened after the Second World War, thanks to the actions, especially of social democratic parties in government, and the influence of the November 1942 liberal-minded Lord Beveridge's report. Is Britain. At the end of the above historical process, the public health care roughly accounts in the world globally for an average 6 to 7% of the budgets. According to the World Health Organization, at the eve of COVID-19 pandemic, the world health expenditure as a share of the global GDP was about 10%. About 3.5% came from private sources, 6.5% from the budgets. Having reminded that to your attention, we may say that in a political system with the right to the health, to health becoming a constitutional right, it is the case of Italy, our health is a constitutional right, and other systems where anyway public health is the main issue of the political bakering, is the case of USA, pandemics become a decisive element of government. And the campaigning in USA show how decisive they could be. At this respect, a short exam of the past plagues and pandemics and their effect is needed. My reference will be the following 10 big pandemics: Pericles plague, Justinianic plague from 540 to 750, the Black Death plague of the 14th century and more, smallpox, salmonella, petechial typhus, and measles, introduced to Central and Southern America by the Spanish conquistadores, syphilis, treponema pallidum, or French disease. French people say it's Italian disease, as a matter of fact, but it happens always like this. It's the same difference between the Russian and American mountains when we go playing with the children. And this is the nationalistic attitude towards even the definition of words. By the way, the third plague, which exploded as a pandemic during the last period of the 19th century and developed the following century. The 19th century plague, cholera, carried to Europe by ships through the caravan route from India after 1817. The Spanish flu spread on April 1918, when the First World War was still not over. And then our modern pandemic, Asian flu, or contemporary, sorry, not modern, contemporary flu like Asian flu in 1957 with 2 million deaths, Hong Kong flu in 1968, and additional waves in 2004 and 2005, another 2 million deaths. And nowadays, our COVID. Let's see and list rapidly some political and international affairs consequences of those pandemics. According to Thucydides, the first writer of international relations, considered to be, Sparta won the war against Athens, the war between 431-404 before Christ, thanks to the Pericles plague. The pandemic of Pericles meant the end of the flourishing Athens and set the conditions for the definitive transplant of the Greek civilizations to Rome, which happened later, of course, but the origins, the roots can be seen here. Into brackets, Pericles and his family died because of that plague. The Byzantine plague, the second I quoted, had enormous consequences, and many historians will refer to it as the door to the Middle Ages. The capital lost 40%, Constantinople. The capital lost 40% of the population, and the Eastern Mediterranean 25%. It shook the economy and the demographic equilibrium of the Euro-Mediterranean region. The Black Death, I don't want to expand too much on this. By the way, the devastation was immense, influencing politics, economics, and arts, especially literature and painting. What interests me more is that the Black Death contributed to the shift of the European power from the Mediterranean societies and economies to Central and Northern Europe, generating the conditions for the rise of the Atlantic powers. Many social and political durable effects came from the continuous and numerous waves of the plague. The few survivors went to occupy the empty house, Boccaccio says a lot about this, and the abandoned lands. The claims of the peasants and artisans forced the king and the dominating establishment to accept a number of demands. It contributed to make more flexible the Middle Age society's tradition of corporate, fixed social and political life. The change had important effects on the relations between the church and people, and between the Christianity and the Pope. With the above in mind, it could be said that what we are accustomed to call modernity started with the effects of the Black Death. I wish to quote something which is never underlined too much by the historians. The Black Death documented an aspect of the traditional state's behavior which is not acknowledged as much as it deserves. The cruelty and the lack of respect for the life of the enemy had an episode which I wish to quote. In accordance with the chronicles, the worst pandemic of history came to the west from the steppes of the Orient, when the Golden Horde led by Ganibek besieged the Genoese colony of Kaffa in Crimea. The besiegers knew they were infected, and with that in mind, before leaving the theater of the war, catapulted the corpses behind the walls of the town. It was the first voluntary biological warfare of humankind, whose effects were soon carried to the Sicily, as Professor Cardini has remembered. 1 century passes, and another biological warfare has tremendous political effects in Central America. The Conquista set the contagious conditions for the total destruction of the local traditional leading class of kings, monks, and religious leaders, scientists, intellectuals, and other leaders, making the local cultures in Central America without any defense and prone to the invaders. It was not voluntary, apparently, but this is what happened. In those years, in the opposite hemisphere, another pandemic, Syphilis, was producing its own effects on certain states' international affairs. The fact that the disease had come to Italy with the French soldiers, for instance, armed many Italian communities and their political leaders against the French emperor. For the record, Francis I, French emperor from 1515 to 1547, died himself of syphilis. The so-called third pandemic spread through the British Empire, especially, not in such an aggressive way to leave disastrous consequences in the empire, but in China, but the political effects were heavy. In China, the imperialist colonialism interventionism in the southern coasts, together with the Opium War and the Boxer Revolt, gave an important example of how the pandemics may influence the state and interstate political developments. In India, the population and the nationalistic press were supporting the repressive measures of social containment fixed by the British authorities. In 1897, the Indian Civil Services officer in charge of the Special Plague Committee and his military escort were killed by a terrorist attack. You see, the history often presents the same movie, the same filming. Let's skip to cholera. At its beginning, it was endemic. When Russian troops in the late 1820s fought the Ottoman Empire, and in 1830 and 1831 stopped the national revolt in Poland, they eventually spread the disease to a few regions of the Ottoman Empire and to the Baltic Sea nations. From the Baltic, the cholera traveled to the west. An interesting research of Gordon Craig, published in 1988, there is no time to quotation, but is very interesting, made manifest the political effects of the Third Plague as far as the British Empire was concerned. The British Empire internal communications exported the disease to Canada, the western and southern areas of the United States, Australia, and Mexico. And this is another element, communication, we will see later on. Spanish flu, in few months, killed at least 20 million persons, at least, sources say even the double. 600,000 in Italy, 675,000 in US. Together with the economic crisis at the end of the 20s, it fueled the growth of Nazism and fascism in Europe. As for the post-war Asian flu, political effects were also there because they contributed to worsen the perception of China and Chinese communities. Is happening in a way the same today, and raise certain functions of the WHO, the World Health Organization, was born after the Spanish flu and reinforced after the Asian flu, and then, well, we will talk later on WHO. The developments of the pandemic at the turn of the late 19th and the early 20th century made manifest the conflict between science and state. This is a key point when we talk about pandemics. The infections coincided with numerous medical and scientific discoveries and the enhancement of the biologic laboratories. Because those new technologies were mostly in the hands of the youngest sectors of the medical establishment, the situation also generated true generational conflicts. There is especially interesting aspects in that conflict made evident by the following quotation from an important article of Myron Eckenberg, Pestis Redux, appeared in Journal of World History in 2002. Small quotation. They, the youngest doctors, had both the capacity and the obligation to intervene globally to combat infectious diseases. On the other were municipal, state, national, and imperial decision makers who found themselves weighing medical risks against overriding political and sometimes even ideological imperatives. A contemporary echo of the quality of such old conflicts between the scientific community and the state policy can be found in an editorial published on October 8 this year by the New England Journal of Medicine under the title "Dying in a Leadership Vacuum." Excerpts from the editorial are absolutely explicit in denouncing the limits of the state action. This crisis has produced a test of leadership, writes the article. Here in the United States, our leaders have failed that test. They have taken a crisis and turned it into a tragedy. The magnitude of this failure is astonishing. In general, not only have many democracies done better than the United States, but they have also outperformed us by orders of magnitude. And the Food and Drug Administration has been shamefully politicized, appearing to respond to pressure from the administration rather than scientific evidence. Instead of relying on expertise, the administration has turned to uniformed opinion leaders and charlatans who obscure the truth and facilitate the promulgation of outright lies. It's the first time that a medicine official, we may say, journal is dealing with political affairs in such way in the whole history of the United States, I read. At the end of the second decade of the 21st century, as at the beginning of the 20th, the scientific truth is opposed to the bric-a-brac on the incompetence of state politics. And the journal concludes, the truth is neither liberal nor conservative. When it comes to the largest public health crisis of our time, our current political leaders have demonstrated that they are dangerously incompetent. We should not abet them, enabling the deaths of thousands more Americans. Another element of the internal and international states' critical dynamics in that very pandemic was the eternal conflict between the local and the global powers. The pandemic per se could not be overwhelmed by a parochial, medical, and governmental approach, and was instead in need of a pan approach, global, world. That's what it means, pandemics, parochial, local approach. There is a contradiction. In its essay of 2002, Heckenberg pointed out the way the third pandemic inflated the nationalistic demands of the populations ruled by the British Crown, as well as inspired prejudices and anti-Asian mobs around the world, replicating what during the Middle Ages pandemic was done against the Jewish. As far as the political effects on the states and interstate system, the cholera outbreak provoked unrest and popular revolts in Europe and Northern America. The cholera is credited by the historians of an important role in the disintegration of the European dynastic empires. The waves of the infection coincided with a series of institutional national building processes taking place in Greece, 1829, Italy, Germany, Poland, and Belgium, 1848, Hungary, 1849. The most evident interaction between the outbreaks and the state's behavior has probably been provided by the Spanish flu. A recent research on the influenza, undersigned by the director of the influenza division at US CDCP, Centers for Diseases Control and Prevention, Mr. Jernigan, illustrates the responsibilities of the states, at the same time political and technical in generating the eruption of that pandemic. The agency enlists a series of factors as reasons why the pandemic developed. All of them are consequences of the public administration system's avoidable limits. Avoidable limits. I cannot provide you with the quotation. I try to resume in few lines. Two were the main factors for propagating the Spanish flu. The crowding of people as super spreader of the transmission, and two were the factors where the authorities fueled the flu. The urban overcrowding accrued by the heavier industrialization for war production, war machinery. Second, the soldiers herded into crowded camps. And this is as far as crowding. The second element is the wartime movements of troops, which was a facilitator of transmission. Two examples: massive troop shift from towns to the training bases. Second, the continuous relocation of soldiers from camp to camp for maneuvers and needs of the war. The effects of the pandemic mix with those of the big war, influenced the rise of the people's discontent. This was one of the effects. And the results of the first war had a bad influence on the European countries' developments, and the rise of fascism and the Nazis was the worst of those developments, not the worst, in fact, because then it came also the Second World War. In relation to our limited interest, the search of the frequencies confirming the input of the pandemics on states and interstate systems, our exam highlighted elements of coincidence and differentiations. Let's see coincidences. Notwithstanding the fact that pandemics are of historical familiarity to humankind, no effective and binding international protocol on pandemic prevention and or repression has still been adopted. It is neglected by the governments the need of a universal, effective and binding protocol on the prevention of pandemics. The role of United Nations and its organizations specialized in health, the WHO, lack finance and